What in God's name is that from Thorin?
Most likely everyone who is a fan of competitive Counter-Strike will have heard of the concept of the tiers of Counter-Strike. And as the term tier is colloquially used amongst the fan community, the esports fans, they tend to mean a class of teams with tier 1, typically meaning the teams that play at the biggest LANs. I mean, a more accurate description of what most people tend to mean by that tends to be like roughly the top 10 ranked teams. Maybe sometimes it's only 8 teams, maybe sometimes it's 12 teams. Then after tier 1, which is the top level, we have tier 2, and these are the teams just below tier 1. They're some of the teams that maybe are bordering on tier 1, and they connect from tier 1 to tier 2. So let's say the next 10 teams, the next 10 to 15 to 12 teams below tier 1, and then we come to tier 3. And tier 3 are the teams that typically aren't making it to big lands, or if they do, it's because of a qualifier from, for example, a CIS qualifier or an Asia qualifier. Tier 2, they're the teams that make up tournaments like DreamHack Open, some of the smaller events that are more localized and have a few big teams, but not all the top teams there, and therefore you make up the other spots with the tier 2 squads. Now, this terminology, as you can already see by the incredibly vague way I was describing it, is pretty weak actually at doing what it's supposed to do as terminology, as a model, which is dividing up the teams, bunching them together like for like, and somehow explaining how good they are, especially because people who come from other games are going to hear terms like tier 1. And I know this has happened many times from people I know from Dota, for example. They think, oh, tier 1, right? You mean kind of what Thorin would say when he makes a preview. You know, I always have the top ones, like the favorites for the event. Then I have a second one that's like potential contenders. Then there's one that's like dark horses, like they could win the event, but don't bet on it. Then I have, you know, it goes like that. They would think, right, tier 1. Oh, you mean like the best teams in the entire world, right? The absolute top of the cream of the crop. So they would think tier 1 right now means Astralis, Navi, maybe FaZe Clan. So when you then say, of course, Gambit have just dropped out as a tier 1 team, they're going to think, Gambit hasn't been a tier 1 in a long time. And then you tell them, oh, North, MIBR, you know, managing to maintain their spots in tier 1, they're going to go, tier what? They're at the top of your tier hierarchy. It's not very good terminology. And while I understand that if you use it as a general class of Counter-Strike, like, you know, it's teams that go to the top tournaments, it's teams that have a chance to do something at tournaments, it vaguely serves a purpose, but I actually think it's a pretty inferior model in contrast to the model I've now implemented in my rankings, which is the classes. Now, this comes from StarCraft Brood War. It might have even come in the past from, I think, chess or something, but I know it from StarCraft Brood War, the Korean game that lasted for like over a decade and had a fabulous scene with massive amount of talent, depth, and constant turnover of good players. Not so many really great players turned over because those are truly special players. And so the whole point of the class system in StarCraft Brood War, as fans used the term, was to be able to more accurately divide up where you sit and make it more in line with what I'd done anyway with the tier system when I do my previews. So for example, you have S-Class. That's the best class, just as with like certain cars that use this terminology. S-Class means an elite performer. This is someone where when they enter a tournament, they are the favorite or one of the favorites to not only win the tournament, but to beat pretty much every team that isn't in the same class, the S-Class. Then you come down, you've got A-Class. These are the very good players or teams, but they're below S-Class. There's something that distinctly means they're not quite in the S-Class, but they're still really good. And beyond the S-Class teams, these are the best teams out there. These are the teams that are going to go far in the tournaments. Perhaps they're going to make semis or quarterfinals. Again, they're going to beat the B-Class and the C-Class and the D-Class and the E-Class. B-Class. These are the good players, but nothing special, nothing truly exceptional. They're not going to do a lot of deep runs in terms, they're not going to win any championships, that's almost for sure, unless it's a fluke. Generally, they're going to lose to S-Class and A-Class players. They will probably beat the C players and most of the B-Class players. You come down to C-Class, D-Class, you can see where it's going from here. It's a similar concept, but you just keep moving down in relative terms. Now, not only does this provide a lot more precision and a lot more thought to be put into how you divide up a player, not just like, oh, well, in the top 10 teams, and you see them at all the big tournaments. So those are tier 1 tournaments, and here are the tier 1 teams, which I think is part of the confusion of how tier 1 team came about, because tier 1 tournament. Instead, what I like about the class system and how it's divided up is it immediately frames any difference in class as quite an interesting discussion. Like, if someone's in S class and there are 2 or 3 teams that are amazing, the team that's just below them, that's at the top of the A class, you can now start to ask yourself, what makes them A class when they're still a very good team, they're at the top of the A class, but doesn't make them S class? Or how far are they from bordering on S class, from entering S class? What would have to happen for them to make the leap up to S class? Or what would have to happen for a team to take a leap down from S class to be at the top of the A class, like this particular team is? Likewise, one of the things I like about this system, which is also why I introduced it for my rankings, is one of the flaws of my rankings is if someone saw like the number 7 team in the world and they think it's a not very good team, like a North, for example, they're going to think in the past, when there was a very, very strong scene, maybe the 7th best team in the past was like Titan with Kenny S, a much better squad than the current North squad with Mertz and Kirby. So they might say, that doesn't make sense. How can this be a 7th team? It's because the numbers are identical, but that doesn't mean that they're identical in terms of how good the teams are, because you get ranked 7th if you're North if there's just only 6 teams better than you, not by you being some exceptional team in an objective sense across history. Whereas if we talk about S class, A class, B class, now if I have them as 7th, but they end up being B class, for example, meanwhile, if I'd gone back in history, maybe Titan is A class because there's so many top teams at the top, Virtus Pro, Fnatic, NIP, LDLC at the time. Maybe at that point in time, even though they're both ranked number 7, you can see the difference, and now you can have a discussion about what makes one A class and one B class. So one of the things I like about it is that there is no requirement to have a specific number of teams in any of the classes, and that is a key concept. In fact, I even think at some point in time, if the scene's wide open enough, I'm thinking somewhat of maybe the uncertainty era of after the player break in 2016, maybe no teams should actually have been S-class at that point in time. Maybe none of them were actually truly that dominant. Maybe we just had an enormous A class of 8 or 9 teams, and they really could potentially each win tournaments. As we saw, there was like 8 tournaments in a row with a different winner. Now, if we apply this to teams, I'll show you how the methodology of this works. You can already see it in my world rankings, which I'll link below, but you can also, we'll go throughout history and we'll pick out some different eras. And if you know that era, as I break down the teams, you'll start to see what I'm talking about. So we'll mainly go with the S-class teams and see how that would have worked in history. So if we go to 2013 and we look throughout this year, there are only 2 teams that are absolute locks to be in the S-class, and that has to be NIP, won the majority of the tournaments that year, were the number 1 team or the number 2 team the entire time, lost very few offline best-of-3 series, always made top 4, won most of the tournaments. Then we've got to have Very Games. Very good team early on, had a little bit of a slump, still winning tournaments that didn't have Nip at them, still making top 8s, top 4s. Then they get shocks in the door. They start winning championships, even international ones with Nip there. They eventually usurp Nip. They start beating them in most series. They have the most top finishes towards the end of the year, win the most tournaments in the latter half of the year. And they're the clear team that takes over from Nip. Beyond that, there's only really 2 other teams you could reasonably argue over the year could have been S-class, and those would be either the Virtus Pro lineups that had top finishes at Star Series, DreamHack, and were able to beat NIP, EMS one summer, or it would be the Astana Dragons team, which spawned out of Virtus Pro, which for a couple of months had a bunch of top 2 finishes, top 3 finishes, consistently elite tier, beating NIP, one of the S-class tier teams, beating most of the A-class tier teams, generally only getting beaten by the S-class, like Very Games most of the time. By the end of the year, they bombed at the end, but still a very strong team. The only other team really through that year that even warrants some consideration is maybe if you go back to that ES Heaven, Vienna into Copenhagen Games, there was obviously that Western Wolves team that rose up, and they had a couple of top 2 finishes, and they had some pretty solid runs. Yes, they fell apart very quickly. So at that point in time, maybe they were S-class, and then they quickly fell off to A-class, and then eventually B-class when they lost some of the players. Now let's skip forward in time. Let's go to one of my favorite eras, 2015. And specifically, when you get to the autumn of this year, the reason why I found ESL One Cologne and DreamHack Cluj-Napoca, events that were pretty close together. ESL One Cologne at that point in time was like halfway through August, and then Cluj-Napoca was like early November. The reason why I found those 2 tournaments really exciting is because at the time we legitimately had 4 teams who could make a case for being S-class. You had the Envious team by this point in time after the second French Shuffle when they had Kenny S and Apex. Obviously, they won a number of tournaments. They made the finals of both of the majors. They won one of the majors. Then you had TSM. TSM had tons of top finishes. They'd beaten Fnatic in the majority of series they'd played against them. It was the Fnatic's era. They'd been top 4 at some of the majors. They'd won 4 or 5 tournaments, coming in Inclusion of Poker as one of the favourites. Fantastic squad. They'd just won PGL at that point in time. You had Virtus.pro, who had a bunch of top 4s at the majors, who'd actually been able to win some of the smaller tournaments, who'd been able to win the Dubai International that had a bunch of the top teams there, including beating Fnatic in a best of 3, beating TSM in a best of 5. You obviously had Fnatic, who, yes, they were borderline falling out of the S-class of the elite tier, but they still came on and won Cologne, beating out Virtus.pro, beating out Envious in the final, still having lots of top 4 finishes, still sometimes playing the top teams in close fashion and only generally losing to the S-class. So either they were dropping out of S-class, in which case they won a tournament while not in the S-class, or they're up there with the others, and we had 4 legitimate S-class teams. Let's skip again a couple of years. Let's go to last year. Now, last year, realistically, we look at the teams and we have Astralis, beginning of the year, fabulous team, number 1 team, won 2 out of the first 3 events, still a top 4 team for most of the year. Made top 4 at both of the majors, winning one of them. We had the FaZe clan, both versions. We had the version with Kiyoshima and Alu, which won a big event, had 4 finals in a row, I think 5 semis in a row. Yes, they bombed the major, still a pretty good performance though. Then we had the other FaZe clan, obviously the one that won ESL New York in dominant fashion, won E-League Premier in dominant fashion, didn't drop a map at any of these tournaments, still had tons of top 4s to end the year, still ended up coming second place to SK a bunch, but ended up winning ECS to close out the year. Absolutely an S-class team, only generally losing to the elite teams. Sure, they had some upsets where they lost, for example, to NIP at IEM Oakland. Then you have finally SK Gaming. Obviously, they won like 7 tournaments or something like that. I think it was 8 tournaments that year. They were able, sure, some of them were smaller events, but even so, they still had a little dominant period, winning 5 out of 6 events. They still managed to make it to the playoffs of the majors. Also pretty legit shit. Obviously, finished up the year winning a bunch of tournaments. These teams legitimately deserve to be in the S-class. But you look towards the end of the year, Mouse Sport starts to come on strong. Bunch of top 4 finishes, win the odd event, start to play FaZe close. You know what? They're not really S-class. They're not winning big tournaments. They're not getting consistent finals or always making top 4. So not quite there. Team Liquid, they had those 2 big finals runs. ESG Mykonos, small event, but against quality teams, beating SK Gaming, an S-class team. They went to ESL New York. They beat SK Gaming again. They beat Astralis. They beat Virtus.pro, who admittedly wasn't that good, but Astralis was still. They go to the final. They were the closest team to taking a map off FaZe. Again, close to S-class, but not really. They didn't win enough tournaments. They didn't have enough placings. They had some great games against SK, but that was mainly one of the only big teams that they were consistently having good games against. So Mouse Sports and Team Liquid, yeah, they're not quite worthy of that status, are they? They don't really get to be there. Virtus.pro early on were S-class, but quickly fell off to A, probably B and C eventually. And that's about it for that year. So now let's come to this year. And for this year, we'll do the S-class and the A-class, and we'll do it right this moment. And you'll see how this kind of a model is so much better than the tier system and actually really helps you divide up your teams and then also contrast who should be beating who and how you think of the teams. Because right at this moment, FaZe Clan just got Olafmeister back. And with Olafmeister back, they had an underwhelming overall placing, wasn't at the level of their normal standard, making all the top 4s, finals, winning tournaments. So with Olafmeister back, the chemistry looks different. As a squad, they've only had the 1 tournament. So actually, I think at this point in time, there's only 2 teams you can say are S-class. Clearly there's Astralis, the best team in the world, but then you've got Navi, a team that generally is going to beat most of the other teams, won many, many big series, amazing map pool, tons of top 4 finishes, bunch of finals, now won 3 out of the last 4 events they've been at. I think reasonably Navi should be S-class, but as I referenced, FaZe Clan probably just dropped down to be a very good A-class team, but have to prove themselves to get back into the S-class. Now, who else is in the A-class? Well, in terms of the holdover from their time with Stiko, you'd have said Mouse Sports. It was still a very good team. They weren't generally going to lose best of 3 series to lesser squads. They were going to lose it to the S-class quite consistently, which is why they themselves aren't S-class, but they're going to beat most of the A-class teams. They're going to be a very consistent team with good placings. They still have got an outside chance to win a tournament, even though, yes, their map pool somewhat fell off. When they've added in Snacks, though, at the moment, you'd have to say they've dropped down to B-class, right? So it's only FaZe at the moment in the A-class and one other team, which is going to be Team Liquid, because, yes, Team Liquid's had a bunch of events where they flunked, where they placed way worse than they should have, where they lost to teams that are in A-class, even lost to some teams that you could say are in the B-class. But generally, they're beating the B-class teams. Generally, they're having pretty good games. They're even sometimes beating the S-Class because they've beaten Navi a couple of times. EPL, now here obviously at E-League. So Team Liquid overall themselves deserve to be in the A-Class. And then B-Class, yes, we're talking about the Mouse Spots of the world, the Norths of the world, MIBRs of the world. Now, what I like about this, again, is it's another model to view the game through. And what I like about models is these help us figure out how we categorize teams and players. Once we categorize them, we can now contrast them and ask why they're in different ones. We can isolate differences between them. What makes this S-Class? What makes this A-Class? We can compare like for like across time. What were S-Class teams like in 2016 contrasted to 2012? How many teams were there that were S-Class in 2012 and 2016? What does that say about the scene? Maybe there's less S-Class teams at one point in time, but a bigger A-Class and therefore a much more competitive scene in that respect. You could have said that this year there was a massive A-Class at certain points in time. So I generally like to have different models, different ways and lenses to look at the game through. And I think classes ends up being a much better, more precise and more interesting system of categorization than tiers, hence why I've now implemented it in my rankings. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Eddie Wingfors, Daniel Yordanov, Robert Baxter, Travis Greb, Kyla Harris, James Harding, Caesar, and special thanks go out to Matt Shakowski and Jerky's Minion in particular. Want teasers for my upcoming content? How about asking me a question for my monthly AMA? Do you want to take part in a discussion about esports with me? How about suggesting a topic or a guest for my content? Put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today.